George Washington was the first President of the United States. George Washington was born February 22, 1732 in Westmoreland County, Virginia. One of the most popular presidents of the United States, George Washington, is known for leading the Continental Army in victory over the British in the American Revolution. He also was the first President of the United States and helped to define what the role of the President would be going forward. George grew up in colonial Virginia. His father, a landowner and planter, died when George was just 11 years old. Fortunately, George had an older brother named Lawrence who took good care of him. Lawrence helped to raise George and taught him how to be a gentleman. Lawrence made sure that he was educated in the basic subjects like reading and math. When George turned 16, he went to work as a surveyor, where he took measurements of new lands, mapping them out in detail. A few years later, George became a leader with the Virginia militia and became involved in the start of the French and Indian War. At one point during the war, he narrowly escaped death when his horse was shot out from under him. After the French and Indian War, George settled down and married the widow, Martha Dandridge Custis. He took over the estate at Mount Vernon after his brother Lawrence died and raised Martha's 2 children from her former marriage. George and Martha never had kids of their own. George became a large landowner and was elected to the Virginian legislature. Soon, George and his fellow landowners became upset with unfair treatment by their British rulers. They began to argue and fight for their rights. When the British refused, they decided to go to war. George was one of Virginia's delegates at the First and Second Continental Congress. This was a group of representatives from each colony who decided to fight the British together. In May of 1775, they appointed Washington as General of the Continental Army. General Washington did not have an easy task. He had a ragtag army of colonial farmers to fight trained British soldiers. However, he managed to hold the army together, even during tough times and losing battles. Over the course of 6 years, George led the army to victory over the British. His victories include the famous crossing of the Delaware River on Christmas and the final victory at Yorktown, Virginia. The British Army surrendered in Yorktown on October 17, 1781. The 2 terms that Washington served as president were peaceful times. During this time, George established many rules and traditions of the President of the United States that still stand today. He helped build and guide the formation of the actual U.S. government from the words of the Constitution. He formed the first presidential cabinet, which included his friends Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, and Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury. George stepped down from the presidency after 8 years or 2 terms. He felt it was important that the president not become too powerful or rule too long like a king. Since then, only one president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, has served more than 2 terms. Just a few years after leaving the office of president, Washington caught a bad cold. He was soon very sick with a throat infection and died on December 14, 1799. He was the only president unanimously elected, meaning all the state representatives voted for him. He never served as president in Washington, D.C., the capital that was named for him. In his first year, the capital was in New York City, then moved to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He was 6 feet tall, which was very tall for the 1700s. The story of George Washington chopping down his father's cherry tree is considered fiction and likely never happened. George Washington did not have wooden teeth, but did wear dentures made from ivory. Washington gave freedom to his slaves in his will.